Hello, Renaissance campers. Um, we just met this afternoon, and I thought, based upon what we had said at the very end of class, at the end of class, we finally got a little bit of a sense of the whole poem. Some of you had already left, had to go. So what I thought I would do is pull back a little bit. As I said to the class after 5:30, I usually assign Jonson's poem a little bit later in the course. And I realized that for pedagogical reasons, it was probably the best thing to do. And I want to go back to a usual starting point, which will resonate, I think, for you. And we will also end with a reading of the last part of Penshurst. So let's go for the share screen thingy. That looks good. Okay, you don't want that. Let's see this. Here we go. Now, one of the things we talked about was the way in which the Renaissance began to understand itself as a different period with a different mindset and a different set of vocabularies from those that preceded them. Even though the terms Middle Ages and Dark Ages were to come much later, the Renaissance had a sense of history. And what I mean by that, in order to have a sense of history, you have to have a clear sense of what came before as being other than you. I mean, the extreme is in what anthropologists used to call primitive cultures, still primitive cultures, in which there is really only repetition of the same moment over and over again. Not that they live meaningless lives, but that the cultural and social and intellectual frameworks in which they live kind of don't really change. People fit into the same forms of identity. And in the Renaissance, and we'll see this and we'll make it clearer, there is a growing sense of making oneself, that is, making oneself new in relationship to the past self, and also the culture making itself. In England during our period, there was enormous enthusiasm. First of all, there was the enthusiasm of humanism, of discovering those ancient texts. And also there was the enthusiasm of England becoming a nation on its own. We'll discuss more the schematic history that is the background for our literature. But some of you may know that the date 1588 is the date of the Spanish Armada. Maybe we'll see a clip from the Elizabeth movie, in which you see the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Spain, King Philip of Catholic Spain, declared war on the English. You should see that movie, by the way. Who stars in that? Kate Blanchett, right? Fantastic. And there is this miraculous victory at sea. And the English naval fleet defeats this enormous naval fleet of the Spanish Armada. And that's like a very significant moment in English history. It's a marker. There are other markers in English history as well, but it's a sense that the English have arrived on the international stage as a power. And not only that, but it's also combined with the English church, which Elizabeth helps found. It goes way back to Henry VIII. You guys must know the story of him. He's the one who founds the church. He had been a faithful Catholic until he wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon. And in the church, there is no such thing as divorce. So Henry, not for theological reasons, he wasn't a great religious thinker or a philosophical thinker or a theologian, but really because he wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, he separated from the church and there from the Catholic Church. And there begins, I think in 1533, 34, you guys can check it. There begins, at that point, is the beginning of the English church. We'll talk about the ways in which it evolves and changes, gets threatened, and then gets held together by Elizabeth. Elizabeth comes to the throne in 1558. So England began to have this self-understanding as a Protestant nation. And because of many factors, which we will discover together, the English felt that they were leading European reform. That is, that the English church was not only the future of England, but the future of Europe. We'll see that in the great poet John Milton, who writes Paradise Lost, but was also a political and theological thinker. We may have talked about this. There are really, I think, England follows in the path of really Old Testament Israelites as chosen people. That we know a little bit from having studied Christianity, that the Christians come to replace the Jews. They become not the chosen people, but Jesus as the chosen announces a kind of universalism. England adopts that language for itself. America later will adopt that language for itself, this idea of exceptionalism and chosenness. And part of that idea of exceptionalism and chosenness is really what makes England really feel itself emerging from something else and becoming something new. So it's not only individual identity, which was happening. And we saw that example in Ben Jonson. He makes himself. He's a self-made man. But in some sense, English culture is making itself, or remaking itself as a Protestant nation. So there was this sense of newness, and it's also balanced by an understanding of a past, or as something, or some kind of baseline. And let's call it, one critic in the 50s called it the Elizabethan World Picture. And when I was in graduate school, everybody trashed him because people thought, well, how could you think there was such a simple thing as a world picture, when of course the critic of the 50s understood that he was speaking in metaphoric language, and it was an interpretive device, a way of getting a sense of how English people structured their thought. And you can see that, and we'll see it in two examples, and then we'll go to Ben Jonson. You can see that in the literature of the time. Here's a passage from a play that people don't read so often. It's Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, which you may remember the character of Troilus from the Iliad. I don't know if we read him, but in a way, Troilus and Cressida is Shakespeare's take on Homer. The characters, however, have their Roman names. And Ulysses, Odysseus, gives a speech. And it has a function in the drama, but we're going to just take it out of context and see, here's an example of a cosmic orderliness that the Renaissance, in some sense, rebels against. So let's read it. The heavens themselves, the planets, and the center. Okay, so we're talking about cosmology here. The heavens themselves, the planets, and this center, the center being Earth, observe degree and priority of place. Insisture, that's a Shakespearean word he makes up that doesn't make it in the English language. Insisture, course, proportion, season, form, office, and custom in all line of order. Office and custom in all line of order. If we remember this image from our first discussion of the Renaissance, we looked at this as kind of as a representation, a visual representation of the hierarchical nature of the European world, or the Elizabethan world. And here we're getting something very similar, not visually, but with language. So office and custom in all line of order, and therefore is the glorious planet Sol, by which he means the sun, in noble eminence enthroned and sphered amidst the other, whose medicinable eye, medicinable means kind of corrective, as you see, corrects the ill aspects of planets' evil, and posts like the commandments of a king's sons, check, to good and bad. So Shakespeare is hard. We talked about that already. What does the sun do? First, the sun is a noble eminence enthroned and sphered amidst the other, whose medicinable eye, somehow at the center, corrects the ill aspects of planets' evil. Now, in our period, there was, and this also was changing, there was the idea that the world was made of these perfect spheres, and that the universe obeyed a certain kind of geometrical symmetry. Now, when great scientists like Copernicus and Galileo came along, they showed that the world is not only not geocentric, meaning Earth-centered, but heliocentric. And they also showed, and this was a problem, that the planets didn't behave exactly as they should. So we would shrug our shoulders and say, big deal, who cares? But for them, there was a sense that the universe and everything above the moon was considered to be perfect. Below the moon is imperfect, above the moon is somehow connected to the divine and perfect. So if you've got planets seeming to fly off in the wrong directions, well, that's a problem. Now, I think Copernicus solves this problem, or one of them does, and shows the way in which the sun makes the gravitational pull of the sun, even though that's not their language yet, that comes along with Newton 100 years later, that the sun kind of pulls these planets back from their threatening to move out of their orbits. So it corrects the ill aspects of planets' evil and posts like the commandments of a king's sons check without check, to good and bad. Now here, I mean, it's a very complicated passage. Simply, first thing is the connection between the king and the sun. Why does Shakespeare here have Ulysses, when talking about cosmic order, compare the king and the sun? Now this goes back to our discussion, and it resonates with our discussion of Ben Jonson. Everything is parallel, right? So just like the sun is the center and the authority and the one who pulls the stray back, so is the king. We talked about the way, even in this representation, Jupiter's chain is here as well, right? Even in this representation, there is a sense in which the world is all connected, and God on top connects with the rulers on the bottom, and they have the same authority, right? Just like we said, if you're born a carpenter's son, what are you going to be when you grow up? A carpenter. Well, this worldview enforces that. And what I say is, so here's where it gets a little complicated, because at the very moment that Shakespeare is representing this cosmic order, and we can say, well, this is kind of an intellectual and certainly a poetic framework that poets use and continue to use, because it's a very potent way of explaining the world, because in one thing you can see the possibility of another thing. That is, in the king you see the sun. That is, they're all connected. Just like we saw in Jonson's poetry, the women bring their pies and they're theirs, and the ripe, remember the ripe young women, they're also, or no, they bring the pies, but the children see in the crests, their family crests, the representations of their family, they see their family's virtues, because everything is connected in this world. We'll come back to that. But what also makes this passage complicated, and Shakespeare and other great poets will never be completely straightforward with it, they play around with it. Even here is, Shakespeare seems to be giving us, like, this is the picture of this world, and he's providing in his play Troilus and Cressida a kind of baseline for a world that's changing. In Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, it's the most corrupt world you could possibly imagine. And what Ulysses talks about here just seems to be a fantasy. And maybe in some ways it is a fantasy. One of the things that you could explore further, which is problematic, is we talked about the change from an older version of the cosmos, the geocentric version, Earth at the center, that was associated with the king Ptolemy, who was a map maker, to the heliocentric version that's associated with the astronomer Copernicus. So Shakespeare plays both. He plays both games, right? In the first line, Earth is in the center, but somehow, and therefore is the glorious planet soul and noble eminence enthroned. So the very minute that Shakespeare's kind of giving us this version of heavenly order, he's playing with both cosmologies at the same time. He knows what he's doing. And in a way, at the very moment that he's presenting this order, he's undermining it. I think that's where we kind of came up with a little bit in relationship to Ben Jonson as well. You see this habit of thought in other thinkers as well. Here's my favorite one. This is from a guy named Thomas Hooker, a strange name for a clergyman, but he wrote this. I had a graduate student who wrote a dissertation on the laws of ecclesiastical piety, talk about a specialty field, but something that Hooker himself is a clergyman who we'll see as a kind of poet. And we'll read this passage, and as we read this passage, we'll have to read it maybe twice. We'll pay attention to the rhetorical structure. Actually, I'll call attention to it as I read it. You'll see that there are a whole bunch of conditional clauses. If, right? If, semicolon, if, semicolon, if, semicolon, if. And well, we'll pay attention to how Hooker is structuring this, and the way in which we'll see here in this passage a similar sense of hierarchy. And when I said before that this is how people thought, you can see that Hooker is writing with this worldview in mind. Let's read it. Now, if nature should intermit her course, and leave altogether, though it were but for a while, the observation of her own laws, if nature stopped working according to the ways it's supposed to, if those principal and mother elements of the world, whereof all things in the lower world are made, should lose the qualities which they now have, the elements are, I think, earth, wind, fire, and air. I might have gotten that wrong. If the frame of that heavenly arch erected over our heads should loosen and dissolve itself, if celestial spheres, that's what we saw earlier, the circle, if celestial spheres should forget their wonted motion and by irregular volubility turn themselves any ways it might happen. Shakespeare's writing about that, right? What happens if they really flew off? If the prince of the lights of heaven, which now is a giant, doth run his unwearied course, the sun, should, as it were, through a languishing faintness begin to stand and to rest himself. These are the days when theologians were poets. Oh, for those days again. Right? This is a boring theologian. If the moon should wander from her beaten way, the times and seasons of the year blend themselves by disordered and confused mixture. The winds breathe out their last gasp. The clouds yield no rain. The earth be defeated of heavenly influence. The fruits of the earth pine away as children at the withered breasts of their mother, no longer to yield them relief. What would become of man whom these things now do all serve? See we not plainly that obedience of creatures unto the law of nature is the stay of the whole world? We'll get to the rhetorical punch at the end, and the way Hooker really doesn't, he doesn't make good on his promise. If, what should follow from the if? Everybody? At the same time? Then, right? If then, but we never get that then. Instead, we get this rhetorical question, what would become of man himself, whom these things now do all serve? So we'll get to that in a second, but you see, I wanted to show you this passage for two reasons. The first one being that just like Shakespeare's Ulysses gives us a sense of an ordered world, Hooker structures this passage, the way he thinks, the way he writes. He starts with nature herself, then the four elements, then the sun, then the moon. Maybe the stars get in there as well. And then he moves down from the moon, the times and seasons of the year themselves by disordered and confused mixture, the winds, the clouds, the rains, the earth, the fruits of the earth, and then finally the children at the withered breasts of their mother. So here also we have a picture of the cosmos, and that picture of the cosmos is created poetically, just like in Shakespeare. We don't get the payoff. It's strange here, and the two things that we're pointing out are related to each other. The end is, what would become of man? If all these things fell apart, what would become of man? And then the conclusion is, see we not plainly that obedience of creatures unto the law of nature is the stay of the whole world? In a way, I mean, here, and I'm going to give you like 10 seconds just to think about this. What is getting expressed when Hooker says this? See we not plainly that obedience of creatures unto the law of nature is the stay of the whole world? On the one hand, we have this confident assertion of this is, I mean, we see in just the representation, this hierarchical universe. At the end, it's really, Hooker's giving this moral message. What must you do? See we not plainly that you have to obey. And what starts out as being this kind of cosmological celebration ends with a very particular point, which is you better behave, you better obey. So we can almost see in Hooker, not almost, I think we can see very plainly, somebody's making a shake, we can see very plainly in Hooker, at the same time that he's giving us this picture, he's expressing extreme anxiety about it. I really think you'll see that I use these Freudian terms, not in the psychoanalytic sense of individual minds, also that sometimes, but really as, and here Hooker, I guess, but also culturally, that there's a sense that Hooker, he needs to say, see we not plainly that obedience of creatures unto the law of nature is the stay of the whole world. He needs to say this because this poetic, I think, fantasy that he represents seems to him to be very, very tenuous, that it's falling apart already. That's what's so kind of interesting about the period, is I think the period, I don't know if this corresponds to anything that ever existed in the Middle Ages, but I think in order for the period to self-understand itself, it had to write about a world that was slowly, seemingly beginning to be lost. Some people express joy about that. I mean, the Renaissance, in a way, is a celebration of that difference. But there's also, as Renaissance man defines himself, and what will happen, and we already mentioned this a little bit in class, for Luther, the emphasis is on the individual, and that goes across the board through almost all the thinkers we'll be reading. And Dr. Feldman and I will be talking about this in almost all the classes we teach, the 18th century as well, that what gets unleashed here is the power of the individual. And the power of the individual, that individual is kind of dangerous to this vision, to this fantasy. So you have both stated at the same time. On the one hand, this, we want this, and you have to obey. And on the other hand, we will see in a lot of the works that we read, this strong emphasis on the individual making himself, in some cases even making herself. And they're doing that. They're kind of declaring their independence from this hierarchical world. Now, finally, I think we're still within our time zone. Finally, let's go back to Mozart's Piano Concerto number 19. I don't mean that. Let's go back to Jonson's Penshurst. Okay. It's a little late for me. I was kind of feeling so guilty today about having left things off in the middle that I really wanted to get this done now. So let's just read the last lines. We noticed in class, and I think everybody was here for that it's not an accident that James and his son Charles show up. And it's also not an accident that there's a place for them in the house. That is Sidney's world, or the world that Jonson is creating, is a world in which Sidney's authority is guaranteed by James. There has to be a royal suite in Sidney's house, because James's kingship lends authority to Sidney. Because in Jonson's world, as we saw, everything is related one thing to another. As we said in class, Penshurst in some sense is a linguistic representation, not only a version of Achilles' shield where we have the whole Homeric cosmos, but it's also a linguistic representation of those spheres, or of that chain of being. So here's the last lines, right? Let's read them again. These Penshursts are their praise, and yet not all. Thy ladies noble, fruitful, chaste withal. So again, asserting the Jonson's strong desire to assert the purity of the relationship between the husband and wife. Jonson was like, he was like a crazy figure, right? I think he killed somebody, and they didn't. He went into a church for refuge, and somehow that allowed him to be a free person. But they cut off his thumb, so if he killed somebody again, they'd know this is a second offense, and he was done. So Jonson is not this pure guy, right? As we said, he's a great businessman, and everything that he does personally, and he works the emerging capitalist system. He makes himself. So at the very moment that he's making himself, he's also praising this worldview. So those two things I was just talking about before really are at odds in Jonson's life. So I think you can really see the same kind of either longing for a past, this ideal vision of a past, or maybe also in Jonson, a sense that this past never exists. And that makes kind of sense of what we read as the ridiculous almost sense of all these fish jumping out of the water and the animals giving themselves up, and it's clearly over the top and fantasy. And I think in some sense, just as this is fantasy, the whole poem is a kind of fantasy, a fantasy of a world that might exist. And really, it's a very, very important transitional poem, because you can see the anxiety here about an emerging mercantile culture. Well, who cares about economy? Well, now, instead of having, remember high school, feudal lords and serfs who live on the land and are all dependent upon each other. And in this way, this is really a kind of idealization of that world, right? Everybody comes, everybody's happy. Even the people who eat downstairs are happy. It's a world of reciprocity. But Jonson himself represents forces which seem to be going against that. So it's on the one hand this older world of reciprocity, but Jonson himself, and he puts himself in the middle of the poem. As we said, it's like in the middle of the poem, Jonson is saying to his patron, pay me, not really pay me, but remember me. I'm the one. I eat at your table. I represent you. I give you your future. I give you this sign through which you are known. Really, it's an incredible gesture, right? It's an amazing poem to be the recipient of. Because Sidney's house not only represents Sidney's house, it represents the whole cosmos. Sidney, we'll read a work of somebody very famous in the Sidney family, Sir Philip Sidney, who writes A Defense of Poetry. These were literate people. Anyway, so let's look at the end. So the purity of relationships, and in that we can almost see that famous line from Hamlet, "The lady doth protest too much," right? There's so much emphasis on it that we can see the uncertainty beneath it. A fortune in this age, but rarely known. They are and have been taught religion. As we said in class, this has to follow. God has to be part of this picture, because that's what enables the king to be king. And the king enables Sidney to be Sidney. Thence their gentler spirits have sucked innocence. Each morn and even they are taught to pray. They're taught the language of prayer with the whole household, and may every day read in their virtuous parents' noble parts the mysteries of manners, arms, and arts. There's a sense here in this world, and this is really a part of the nostalgia, that there is a relationship between the outside and the inside. And that's one of the things that kind of vanishes. In a way, like if you think back to Sophocles and Aeschylus and then Euripides, Euripides is that world where everything's falling apart. Nothing means anything anymore. And Jonson here is writing about a world in which things not only mean things in relationship to each other, we look at a person on the outside and we know what their inside is. Signs are reliable. And that's part of the fantasy as well. When I say signs, I mean language is reliable. So they, with the whole household, and may every day read in their virtuous parts, their virtuous parents' noble parts, the mysteries of manners, arms, and arts. Now, Penshurst, they that will proportion thee with other edifices, they that look at, compare you to other buildings, when they see those proud, ambitious heaps and nothing else. When they look at all the other stuff, the ambitious heaps, the houses in East Hampton that are these monstrosities that are built to show off wealth, right? And those are false signs or false signifiers. They claim to be doing something. They claim to be showing something real, but if you look underneath, there's nothing there. when they see those proud, ambitious heaps and nothing else, may say their lords have built, but thy lord, Sidney, or thy lord, I guess I think maybe they're talking to Jonson, but thy lord, Jonson's lord, dwells, Sidney dwells. As we pointed out, there's a difference in the resonance, in the connotations between built and dwells. Building has this sense of maybe impermanence. Certainly dwells has a sense of permanence. There's something permanent about this. But again, just like we saw in Thomas Hooker, I think we can say there's a certain kind of anxiety here. On the one hand, I mean, it's a hard poem to read, like we're continually come back to this, that we can read things in the past, and even though the assumptions that they have about the world are very different than ours, when we learn them, we can see the way a poet manipulates them. As I said, any great poet is not going to take the basic assumptions of the period and just repeat them. That would make him a bad poet. So Shakespeare, Jonson, Hooker, they use these frames to say something. Jonson's message is hard to understand here. On the one hand, read it like it is. Sidney reads it like it is, right? When he gets it, boy, he's happy, right? And Jonson becomes, and he's rewarded. But on the other hand, there may be the sense of, in the excess of this, in the over-the-topness of this, maybe there's also a skepticism about it, or a sense, just like in Hooker, like maybe this world is going away, and maybe this is just a picture, a postcard that exists from in the past. It's kind of fading into the past. I mean, it's strange because it's a simple poem about a house, but it really is it marks a kind of transitional period. And that's why it's so interesting for us, between this world where everything fits in hierarchies, and we already have maybe a sense that world is being lost. And I think that's really how to read it, that Jonson himself, even as he's praising Sidney, and I think he is genuinely praising this idea of reciprocity, maybe as a fantasy, he certainly is praising this idea of language, a language or representation, signs which mean what they say. And there's the threat now that language will cease to do that too many people have too many different languages and they conflict, or people manipulate language in such a way that instead of showing themselves, they hide themselves, right? And I mean, in a way, this poem is afraid of that, afraid of the wrong kind. Here's another term that I'm going to use, afraid of the wrong kind of artifice. Artifice meaning it's used here. Artifice means what's artificial. And there's a fear of a kind of artifice, which is, and here's another defense of poetry, right? Or defense of a certain kind of art. There are two kinds of art. There's Penshurst and the other buildings. The other buildings, they are just exteriors. There's nothing beneath them. Nothing, right? They're built out of nothing. Penshurst, however, Penshurst represents a kind of art in which, or building itself, the house itself, in which the house itself and everything, all of its environs, all of the things that you see represents something that's behind it. Again, let's go over it. The pies are an emblem of the women. The virtuous arms are emblems of the parents. The exterior is related, or one thing is related to another, and that really threatens to fall apart when everything is just surface. Okay, so good. So we did, I think, I feel a little bit better now. I think we did justice to Penshurst, and we did so, just to wrap things up, we did so through looking at the way in which Elizabethans, and let's just use that as the catch-all, these early Elizabethans who are first discovering themselves as English people, have this idea of hierarchy. It's associated for them with the past. And even as they represent it, we see the way that they're kind of fetching and playing with it. Shakespeare with two centers, like what, right? He's just kind of throwing this off. Hooker giving us this very noble and ambitious and beautiful version of the universe, but at the very end, it really just turns out like, you better behave, because if not, everything's going to fall apart, right? Because if you don't, the whole world runs upon obedience, and the most problematic part of the world is man. So you better obey. So Hooker he's both poet, but really by the end, he's churchman. And then we saw the same thing in Jonson. So from here, and I'll either you'll be seeing this, I will have written you an email or I will write you an email in which we will, as we continue, we will talk about the way in which we see three movements essentially: educational, kind of commercial or social, and also theological. We already talked a little bit about the theological. The theological is the Reformation and our emphasis in relationship to that, to the individual. We'll also talk about different means of education, how education changes during our period and how important that is. Really, this is a period of re-education. So we'll actually look at a set of passages that describe a certain kind of pedagogical method. And then also, we said the theological, we said the educational, and then also, in a way, the commercial. And for that, we'll have to talk a little bit more about Elizabeth and her coming to power. I mean, she's behind everything, the theological as well. But also the ways in which people began to reconceive themselves as socially mobile. And the change in economic structure allows for that social mobility. We'll talk about how that happens, why London becomes this, how London becomes this central commercial power. People come from the country into the city. There's the importation of goods from the New World. People start trading things, right? So that also creates this possibility for mobility. What we'll see across the board with all three of them is this emphasis on the individual. And especially in Hooker, we see that, and especially in Hooker and in Jonson also, to a lesser extent, we see this anxiety about an individual who might fly off and destroy this beautiful aesthetic harmony. Okay, so I'll either see you next week or I'll see you soon.